Chapter 4. Being a mental patient. God is a fact. Similarly, my disbelief in mental illness does not mean that I do not recognize the existence of psychiatrists and mental patients. It is precisely because supernatural beings and mental diseases are abstract or imaginary constructs without material existence that their existence is claimed or inferred in a circular fashion from the existence and belief of priests and worshippers, of psychiatrists and mental patients. However, it would be a mistake to believe that the existence of St. Peter's Cathedral in Rome proves that Jesus is the Son of God, or that the existence of the National Institute of Mental Health in Bethesda proves that mental illness exists, although this has, more than once, been seriously suggested to me by people listening to me lecture on the myth of mental illness. In short, although mental illness may not exist, mental patients do. Who then are they? What is wrong with them? Why are they considered to be ill, and why mentally? Becoming a mental patient. Psychiatrists rarely consider the question of how a person becomes a mental patient, and when they do, their answers are likely to be wrong. For example, Jack Ewalt and Dana Farnsworth, both professors of psychiatry at Harvard, write, "A person thus becomes a patient when his capacity to compensate for all the unfavorable factors in his emotional environment breaks down, and he is unwillingly or unknowingly impelled to indulge in behavior which is unacceptable to himself or those with whom he is associated or comes in contact." It is not true, however, that a person becomes a patient when there is a change in his capacity to cope, or because he unwillingly or unknowingly misbehaves. The truth is that a person becomes a patient when he defines himself, or when others define him, as a patient, and when that definition is formally or officially supported as legitimate or valid. Specifically, for a person to become a psychiatric patient, two circumstances must come together. 1. An individual must make certain claims about himself, or others must make certain claims about him. That is, he must designate himself or be designated by others as mentally ill. 2. A psychiatrist or judge must concur with this claim. That is, he must diagnose or validate the designated person as mentally ill. When this process has run its course, the product is the social phenomenon called a mental patient, or more accurately, a designated mental patient. The mental patient, voluntary or involuntary. Persons assume or are assigned to the role of mental patient in several ways. Some come from among persons identified in Table 2.1, Row 3. Typically, such an individual seeks out a physician with what he, the patient, believes or claims to be the symptoms of a medical disease. The physician examines him, but can find nothing wrong. If the patient persists in making demands on his doctor, and if the doctor grows tired of his demands, then the doctor is likely to refer the patient to a psychiatrist. It is estimated that 60,000, 70, or even 80% of patients seen by general practitioners and family physicians have no demonstrable bodily illness. Many of these persons are recruited into and join the ranks of mental patients. Another group of mental patients is comprised of persons who seek out psychiatrists on their own initiative for the help they hope to obtain from them. Although these patients are physically healthy, or if not, their diseases are considered to be unrelated to their complaints, they want some sort of psychiatric help and willingly cooperate with a variety of so-called psychiatric treatments, psychological as well as physical. Insofar as a person assumes the role of mental patient voluntarily, his situation resembles that of any other client seeking professional help. The clients of architects, attorneys, accountants, and physicians differ in terms of the sorts of service each seeks, but are similar in that each is free to initiate and terminate his relationship with the expert who, as the saying goes, is on tap, not on top. However, it is precisely with respect to the ability or power to control the expert-client relationship that the situation of the mental patient typically differs from that of the medical patient. To understand this difference, we have to consider the history of psychiatry, as well as the connection among the ideas of insanity, incompetence, and irresponsibility. Medicine, psychiatry, and self-ownership. With the exception of psychiatry, the practice of modern Western medicine is premised on the principle of the self-ownership of adults. Typically, doctors and patients are free to reject each other. In other words, each must consent to the relationship, the doctor to providing medical care, the patient to receiving it. Diagnostic and therapeutic interventions are medically legitimate because they are scientifically prudent, and legally legitimate because the patient consents to them. See Table 4.1. Table 4.1. Illness and Consent, the Politics of Medical Intervention. Nature and Name. 1. Medical intervention in the presence of disease with the sane subject's consent. Conventional treatment of injuries, infections, tumors, etc. Literal treatment. 2. Medical intervention in the presence of disease without the sane subject's consent. Medically, treatment without consent. Legally, assault and battery. 3. Medical or psychiatric intervention in the absence of disease with the sane subject's consent. Abortion, voluntary psychiatric interventions, etc. Metaphoric treatment, not treatment. Help. 4. Medical intervention in the absence of disease without the subject's consent. Involuntary psychiatric interventions, not treatment, social control, punishment, torture. This fundamental political principle of self-ownership, which undergirds not only medical but also economic and legal relations in free societies, was nearly fully articulated by Aristotle. According to it, a person owns himself, body and soul, and has the right to use himself as he deems fit, so long as he does not injure others. Aristotle's only reservations to this principle were with respect to suicide and slavery. He considered suicide to be a violation of man's obligations to the state, and slavery to be the natural condition of the slave. Defining a voluntary agent as one who knows both the person he is affecting by his action and the instrument he is using, Aristotle concluded that it is not possible to treat oneself unjustly. No one can commit adultery with his own wife, or housebreaking on his own house, or theft on his own property. It is this principle that has led to the adoption of the legal rule that no one except infants, idiots, and the insane ought to be medically diagnosed or treated without his consent. I am stating this in the classic idiom of English law, dating from a time when a man was regarded as insane only if he was like a wild beast. There are two ways in which major departures from this principle may be rationalized and justified. One way is to expand the class constituting exceptions to the rule, typically by treating certain persons, for example women, criminals, blacks, mental patients, as if they were children. This, of course, is called paternalism, and I shall say more about it presently. The other way out of the political constraints of self-ownership is to reject the principle altogether, or to qualify it with strong claims of co-ownership, as it were, in favor of possession by other parties, such as God or the state. For example, if God owns the body and wishes it to be inviolate to human prying, then dissection will be considered a crime. This perspective is by no means extinct today. Those who do not share it call it religious fundamentalism. Similarly, if the state owns the body, then the drugs legislators condone will be considered licit and therapeutic, whereas those they condemn will be considered illicit and pathogenic. And suicide will be illegal, not because it is an affront against the rules of God, but because it is an affront against the rules of health. Many years ago, I proposed the term therapeutic state for the political system generated by and embodying this principle. Ironically, many of our contemporary medical and psychiatric dilemmas arise from the fact that the more physicians are recognized as experts on health, the more power they are given to determine the social behavior of sick persons. Chemists know how to distinguish gold from other elements better than ordinary people, but the state gives them no power over the conduct of persons possessing gold. However, supposedly because psychiatrists know how to distinguish sick minds from healthy minds better than ordinary people, the state gives them power over the conduct of persons allegedly possessing sick minds. The following statement by Norman Fowler, British Secretary of State for Social Services, is sadly revealing. "I think that schizophrenia is a medical illness," Fowler told The Times, London, "and patients should have whatever treatment the doctors think necessary." Emphasis added. Well, arthritis and atherosclerosis are also medical diseases. Does Fowler propose that patients no longer be permitted to reject being treated for these diseases? If this is how the second highest ranking British politician in charge of health policies thinks and talks, can we expect anything else but a further strengthening of the powers of a centralized, medicalized therapeutic state? Like marriage, the relationship between psychiatrist and patient involves two persons. Accordingly, it is the combination of the former's penchant for paternalism with the latter's desire for dependency that creates the relationship that ultimately develops between them. The truth is that not only are many psychiatrists not interested in a reciprocal type of relationship with their patients, but many mental patients are not interested in such a relationship either. Whether we like to or not, what characterizes many psychiatric patients and situations is precisely that they are coercive. Schizophrenic self-disregard, agitated depression, threats of injury to self or others are intensely coercive communications. Indeed, in the interview in the Times from which I just quoted, a typical problem presented by schizophrenic patients was seen as this. Have you, the interviewer asks Fowler, any other ways you can help? For example, widowed mothers living in terror of being attacked physically by very strong sons. Some illness. I have no blanket solution for that, replies Fowler. Thomas Hobbes would have had a solution for it. When Britain was the cradle of Western liberties, its leaders knew that crime was not a disease and that disease was not a crime. Obviously, anyone who interacts with a violent person, especially if he chooses to do so, and if the violent person is called a mental patient or a schizophrenic, finds himself in a situation where he is expected to do something. The superior person, family member, psychiatrist, policeman, placed in such a position has essentially three options. 1. He can counter-coerce, for example, by committing the patient as psychotic. 2. He can allow himself to be coerced, for example, by catering to the demands of the patient. Or 3. He can escape from the field, for example, by severing the relationship with the coercing person, or he can take care and not enter the field in the first place. Medicine and psychiatry, becoming a patient and becoming a mental patient. Medicine originates from the facts of injury and illness, the discomfort and disability they cause, and the search for relief they generate. Persons become medical patients because they suffer, seek relief from their suffering, and turn for relief to experts whom they endow, rightly or wrongly, with the power of healing. In short, medical practice originates from below, from the patient, and medicine is as old as mankind. Moreover, the feature of voluntariness is crucial to being a medical patient. Indeed, it is so basic that we take it for granted. Unless unconscious, a person typically enters a hospital by checking in, much as he enters a hotel, and he can, of course, check out whenever he wishes. There is no legal mechanism for forcing a person to enter a hospital or remain there against his will. Unconscious persons are regarded as having given tacit consent to being patients. Unlike medicine, psychiatry originates from the facts of deviant and disturbing behavior, sometimes caused by brain disease, the discomfort and distress such behavior causes others, and the search for the control of the disturbing behaviors and persons by those disturbed. Persons thus become psychiatric patients because they make others suffer, because those they make suffer seek relief from their discomfort, and because these sufferers turn for relief to experts whom they endow, rightly or wrongly, with the power to restrain and treat the offending person who is designated as mentally ill. In short, psychiatric practice originates from above, from those having power over the patient, and psychiatry is only as old as is this particular social arrangement for controlling those who burden or offend others. Historically, psychiatry is synonymous with involuntary and institutional psychiatry. Originally, all mental patients were involuntary patients, incarcerated in mental institutions. This arrangement prevailed from the first invention of madhouses in the 17th century until the early part of the 20th century. As recently as the early 1940s, when I was a medical student in Cincinnati, a person could not be a voluntary patient in an Ohio state mental hospital. That arrangement was consistent with the view that madness or insanity, now called severe mental illness or psychosis, is a condition characterized by a loss of competence or rationality. It is the nature of psychiatry, write Albert Johnson and Burr Eichelman, two medical ethicists, to work with patients who suffer from impaired perceptions of themselves and the world. It is an impairment of the consenting organ itself, which is being treated. The authors go on to observe that, of course, this has always been the condition of psychiatry. Its patients have always been the troubled, the confused, the deranged. As a result, psychiatric treatments, such as commitment, the shock therapies, and psychosurgery, were often imposed on the supposedly incompetent. It is important to re-emphasize that the medical patient has typically been presumed to be competent, whereas the mental patient has typically been presumed to be incompetent. Competence is one of those troublesome concepts that combines an observer's subjective judgment with an objective condition supposedly exhibited by the subject. In actual use, such concepts are bound to be corrupted by the self-interests and prejudices of the judging parties. For centuries, it was taken for granted, and it is still widely believed, that an insane person is irrational and legally incompetent. The range of this incompetence varies, but typically includes such things as looking after one's own best interests, executing binding contracts, being responsible for the crimes one commits, and standing trial. These remarks, on which I shall expand later, see chapters 8-11, are intended to remind the reader that although incompetence and insanity are not purely medical concepts, or perhaps are not medical concepts at all, modern societies use physicians, and physicians use these concepts to implement mental health laws. Thus, while experts on forensic psychiatry often disclaim insanity and mental disease as medical concepts, legislators deputize doctors to enforce laws based on these very concepts. For example, Herbert Fingaret, who writes frequently on forensic psychiatry, states, "In our earlier examination of the notion of mental disease, we saw that it is not a medical concept. That is, it is in fact not defined by current medical doctrine, could not even in theory have any systematic role within purely medical doctrine, and moreover is now increasingly recognized by the courts as a legal rather than a medical concept." Notwithstanding many similar assertions in the legal literature, physicians are legally authorized to commit a person to a mental hospital, detain him there as a patient, and treat him for his mental disease against his will. Thus, under the 1959 British Mental Health Act, any qualified medical practitioner can sign an emergency order. No expertise in psychiatry is required. Perhaps because insanity has in fact no medical meaning, many mental health laws require that not one but two doctors sign the commitment papers, presumably in order that one could act as a corrective to the other, but actually to strengthen the medical legitimacy of the procedure. Today, the importance of involuntariness in the role of mental patient is as great as it ever was, perhaps greater. This fact is concealed, however, both by private psychiatric practice and by what is, ostensibly, voluntary mental hospitalization. I say ostensibly because no person can properly be said to be a voluntary mental patient so long as he can be intimidated by the threat of involuntary incarceration. Indeed, because of the overt and covert threat of involuntary mental hospitalization, it is impossible to say how many persons now enter or stay willingly in mental hospitals. Moreover, even the person who enters a mental hospital voluntarily cannot leave at will. His status is easily converted from voluntary to involuntary. Finally, there is a large and important class of mental patients comprised of persons who become patients by breaking the law and are then diverted from the criminal justice system to the mental health system. Such persons are, in effect, sentenced to incarceration in a mental hospital instead of a prison. It is now also possible to sentence such persons to involuntary patienthood in psychiatric outpatient facilities. Let me now summarize the similarities and differences between the conventional uses of the terms patient and mental patient. The term patient is reserved for persons who assume the sick role by asserting that they are ill or by having some type of identifiable relationship with a physician or hospital. Persons complaining of being ill, regardless of where they may be, and persons situated in hospitals, nursing homes, clinics, and physicians' offices are thus all called patients. On the other hand, if a person does not seek medical help and has no identifiable formal relationship with a medical personage or institution, he is not, even if he has a demonstrable bodily illness, considered to be a patient. For example, it would be wrong to call a Christian Scientist suffering from cancer but refusing medical help a patient. Insofar as a person voluntarily assumes the role of mental patient, either by asserting that he is mentally ill or by establishing an identifiable relationship with a mental health professional, the roles of patient and mental patient are similar. The two roles differ, however, in all those ways in which it is possible to ascribe the role of mental patient, but not of medical patient, to a person against his will. For example, virtually anyone in conflict with the law may be declared mentally ill. Such persons are then typically called mental patients, especially if their involuntary psychiatric scrutiny is legally legitimized, for example, as part of a court-imposed plea of insanity or ruling of incompetence to stand trial. This is why we are often told not only that there are millions of mentally ill persons in this country who do not receive the psychiatric care they need, but also that there are millions of mental patients who do not receive such care. By contrast, there are millions of poor people suffering from leprosy or malaria in underdeveloped countries who are never called patients. In short, anyone called mentally ill is ipso facto also considered to be a mental patient, and vice versa. I view this conflation of the alleged condition called mental illness and the social role of mental patient as further support for my contention that mental illness is a non-existent or fictitious condition, because there is no way of objectively establishing that a person suffers or does not suffer from mental illness. The condition is inferred from the social role, and vice versa. Being a mental patient and having a mental illness, is there a difference? As I have shown, having an illness and being a patient are concepts that vary independently. It is possible to have an illness and not be a patient, or to be a patient and not have an illness. This is not true for the relationship between having a mental illness and being a mental patient, especially if the role is ascribed rather than assumed. It is not possible to be a properly certified mental patient and not have, that is, not be considered to have, a mental illness. For example, even if a person is regarded as having been improperly hospitalized, he is still considered to have been a patient. A single illustration should suffice. Between 1980 and 1984, a period during which psychiatrists have continued to trumpet the triumphs of the pharmacological treatment of mental illnesses, making hospitalization largely unnecessary, adolescent admissions to private psychiatric hospitals increased more than 350%, from 10,765 to 48,375. According to a report in Newsweek, in many cases young people are being hospitalized for afflictions such as conduct disorder and adolescent adjustment disorder, emphasis added. Nowhere do the reporters for Newsweek question that these youngsters have bona fide mental diseases or are bona fide patients. My contention that psychiatrists have succeeded in combining and equating mental illness as a condition and the mental patient role is also exemplified by the psychiatric approach to malingering, now called factitious disorder. The unique aspect of these factitious disorders is that the sole objective is to assume the role of a patient, without an acute emotional crisis or a recognizable motive. Indeed, without a need for treatment, many of these patients make hospitalization itself a primary objective and often a way of life. Here a person is defined as a patient solely because he wants to be a patient, and as mentally ill solely because he is a patient. Revealingly, psychiatrists do not consider such alleged maladies to be metaphoric. As in all forms of factitious illness, assert the authors, the production of the illness is factitious, but these patients are truly ill, emphasis added. The authors seem to relish the internal contradictions inherent in their image of this non-illness that is really an illness. After emphasizing that persons suffering from factitious disorders assume the patient role even though they are without a need for treatment, they explain that the introduction of these disorders into the official psychiatric nomenclature is expected to stimulate research in the area of treatment. When the mental patient is not a patient, since classifying persons as patients serves the purposes of the classifier, some people will try to enlarge the category called patients, and others will try to constrict it. I have cited some examples of the effort to expand this category, and now want to cite some examples of the effort to constrict it, specifically, of defining persons conventionally regarded as mental patients as not patients. I have always believed that people appreciate a service in proportion to what they pay for it, and vice versa. This principle is certainly supported by the fact that companies selling health insurance have traditionally rebelled against the idea that mental illness is like any other illness. During the past several decades, however, they have increasingly been forced by psychiatric lobbyists and their supporters in the various state legislatures to accept this absurd proposition. The coverage of alcoholism, chemical dependency, and other autogenous diseases has, of course, contributed its share to the burgeoning cost of health insurance. You may be startled to read, observes financial columnist Sylvia Porter, that a large percentage of the total healthcare bill employers pay goes to mental health care, often as high as 20%. As a result, she continues, psychiatric care will be separated from other medical expenses in employee assistance programs. For funding purposes, such programs are treated apart from group health benefits, emphasis added. A specific effort to constrict the category called mental patient is reflected in certain health insurance policies. Many insurance companies offer policies paying benefits in case of illness. Some reimburse hospital and related medical expenses, while others pay cash benefits directly to the policyholder for being in a hospital. How do policies of the latter type define whether a person should be counted as a patient and hence a proper recipient of benefits? They do so by reference to whether or not he resides as a patient in an institution called a hospital. This makes the criteria for determining whether an institution qualifies as a hospital crucial, since it is the definition of a hospital that will determine whether the insured person is or is not a bona fide patient. The typical health insurance policy providing direct cash payments in case of confinement in a hospital defines hospital as follows. Hospital means an institution which diagnoses and treats injured and sick persons. Hospital does not mean a mental institution or a place for the care and treatment of drug addicts or alcoholics, emphasis added. If the insurance industry insisted that mental hospitals are not hospitals, period, there would perhaps be less confusion about the differences between bodily illness and mental illness. Instead, the industry has chosen to legitimize mental illness as a bona fide illness, underwriting special coverage for it, thus creating one of the most lucrative business enterprises of our day, the private mental hospital corporation. The most frequently encountered mental patient. My foregoing analysis is supported by the account American psychiatric authorities give of the most commonly encountered mental patient, namely, the person suffering from a personality disorder. Here is what the authors of the Comprehensive Textbook of Psychiatry, 3, tell us about him. Those with personality disorders crowd the rosters of clinic dropouts, treatment failures, and referrals to other agencies. For the very persons whom psychiatry labels with the term personality disorders are the same persons called bad or deviant, sinning, or loathsome. Doctors hate hypochondriacs. Attempted suicide is still a felony on many statute books, and the righteous and intolerant single out paranoiacs for special disdain. Those with personality disorders make up a large percentage of people in jails, on welfare rolls, and in the general practitioner's waiting rooms. The mind boggles. Hypochondriacs, paranoiacs, individuals who attempt suicide, bad persons, are all sick, suffering from the dreaded disease called personality disorder. I want to emphasize that the authors of this prestigious text do not claim that persons suffering from personality disorders exhibit demonstrable brain diseases, as do persons with organic mental disorders, or that they suffer from the manifestations of probable brain disorders, as, according to them, do persons with schizophrenia, or that they want to assume the role of mental patient, as they say, do persons with neuroses. In short, although persons with personality disorders exhibit none of the criteria of mental illness used in the other chapters of this textbook, that is, proven brain disease, putative brain disease, or assuming the role of mental patient, they are nevertheless classified as suffering from a mental illness. Why? Because they are functionally disabled. Concerning the social functioning, or rather non-functioning, of persons with personality disorders, we learn that, although until recently psychiatrists were reluctant to acknowledge it, those with personality disorders are functionally more disabled than the neurotic psychiatrists prefer to treat. The contradictions multiply. First, we are told that people with personality disorders have no bodily disease and do not want to be mental patients, but nevertheless are mentally ill and psychiatric patients. Now we learn that psychiatrists do not like to treat persons suffering from personality disorders, yet these patients are more commonly encountered in psychiatric practice than any others. Moreover, many non-patients also suffer from this malady. Personality disorders account for the most irrational elements among the leaders of society. Then, even before finishing the introduction, the authors offer us the following remarkable passage, completely contradicting claims advanced elsewhere in the book, where they assert that the neuroses are diseases. Those with personality problems are not easy to understand. The neurotic is often a self-diagnosed sinner who willingly begs for psychiatric help, confesses his problems, and often thereby cures himself. In marked contrast, someone with a personality disorder is far more likely to refuse psychiatric help, point out the psychiatrist's problems, and by persisting in his annoying behavior, cause colleagues in other disciplines to scoff at psychiatrists' competence. Virtually all of the issues I have discussed earlier are wonderfully illustrated in these lines. Note, for example, the author's disdain for the neurotic. He is a sinner who begs for help and confesses his problems. It would seem, then, that the neurotic's problems are existential or moral rather than medical or psychiatric. Nevertheless, psychiatrists eagerly embrace him as a sick patient. Note further the author's explicit acknowledgement that persons sick with personality disorders refuse psychiatric help. It is not surprising that the authors find them not easy to understand. They do not want to understand such persons. They want to define them as mentally ill and coerce them into becoming psychiatric patients. Finally, the fact that the person afflicted with a personality disorder wants to stay away from psychiatrists is interpreted as follows. Because those with personality disorders do not routinely acknowledge pain from what society perceives as their symptoms, the person is often regarded as unmotivated for treatment. This is an absurd assertion. The persons the authors here describe are not regarded as unmotivated for treatment. They are unmotivated for it because they simply do not want it. Despite these seeming obstacles to therapeutic cooperation, the authors proceed to a clinical overview of the disease. After having read their introduction, one wonders how they will identify this disease and what rationale they will offer for claiming it as a disease. Personality disorder, they state, is a mental disease with 4 characteristics. The first characteristic is an inflexible and maladaptive response to stress. The second characteristic is a disability in working and loving that is generally more serious and always more pervasive than that found in neurosis. The third characteristic is that personality disorders almost always occur in response to a social context. And the fourth characteristic is a peculiar capacity to get under the skin of others. A remarkable list indeed. The author's suggestion for therapy is even more remarkable. Reliable diagnosis depends on what the psychiatrist can observe with certainty. However, the successful management of patients who insist that nothing is the matter must be based on what he can infer. The authors simply ignore the vexing question of what entitles psychiatrists to regard a person as a patient if he insists that nothing is the matter, and what entitles them to treat such a person against his will. Being incarcerated, the mental hospital patient and the prison inmate. Long before I became a psychiatrist, I was impressed by the fact that in modern societies, many individuals are incarcerated like prisoners in institutions, but are called patients. No doubt, others have been impressed by this also. I assume they have dismissed it, however, as a social arrangement justified by medical considerations. I could never believe this. Because of my attention to the role of coercion in psychiatry, my critics have consistently accused me of overemphasizing its importance. I, for my part, feel that psychiatrists underestimate its importance, and for an obvious reason. the social role of the mental hospital patient resembles the role of the prison inmate much more than it resembles the role of the medical patient. Carl Jaspers, who abandoned a successful psychiatric career to become a philosopher, recognized this embarrassing similarity but chose not to pursue it. Admission to hospital, he wrote, often takes place against the will of the patient, and therefore the psychiatrist finds himself in a different relationship to his patient than other doctors. He tries to make the difference as negligible as possible by deliberately emphasizing his purely medical approach to the patient, but the latter in many cases is quite convinced that he is well and resists these medical efforts, emphasis added. Psychiatrists, politicians, and others concerned with mental health policy systematically reject this insight, a denial that immediately derails their efforts to help the persons they insist on calling mentally ill. Moreover, this hypocritical equation of the situation of the mental patient with that of the medical patient obstructs the more relevant and fruitful comparison of the situation of the mental hospital patient with that of the prison inmate. Like criminal behavior, mentally ill behavior is a deviation from psychosocial, that is, conventional, ethical, legal norms of conduct. Like conviction for crime, commitment for mental illness cannot come into being without someone's lodging a complaint about the offender patient, and without that complaint being legitimized by appropriate social authorities. The social anatomy of crime, with and without victims. Lawbreaking is a phenomenon. Law and crime are social constructs. For a crime to exist, there must be a triangular relationship, such as the following. Smith steals Jones' car and wallet in New York, drives to Boston, and lives it up using Jones' credit cards. Jones complains to the police about the theft. The police arrest Smith, and a judge sends him to jail. In short, there is an offender, a victim, and a social authority with legitimacy to validate or invalidate the complaint, and with power to coerce the offender. Although people sometimes naively believe that crime consists simply of lawbreaking, that is not so. A crime can be said to exist only when a person lodges a complaint against another person and when his complaint is formally legitimized as valid. Suppose that Jones does not complain to the police about the loss of his car, perhaps because it contains evidence of his own criminal activity. How would the police know that a crime had been committed? They couldn't. My point here is similar to that of the classic question about a tree falling in a deserted forest. Does it make a sound? The answer is no. It generates sound waves, but not sound, since the term sound refers to that which is heard, Webster's. A similar distinction obtains between law-breaking as an event and crime as a legal concept. This is not hair-splitting. On the contrary, it is a distinction with supremely important practical consequences. As I noted, if a robbery is not reported, there can be no prosecution because there is no suspect. Suppose, however, that the police catch the culprit by accident and charge him with the crime. There may still be no crime unless the victim is willing to testify against the offender. In the practical administration of the criminal law, it is the plainest common sense that even if an accused is in fact guilty, the police may have no case against him if the victim refuses to cooperate with the prosecution. If pressed to testify, all an unwilling witness has to do is say in court, "I don't remember," if that is the man who robbed me or whatever, and the case against the accused collapses. This is one of the reasons why many gangland crimes committed by professional criminals against each other are impossible to prosecute. Typically, then, ordinary crime presupposes two conflicting parties, one asserting that he has been victimized, the other, usually, denying that he is at fault. This is why the concept of so-called victimless crime is inconsistent with Anglo-American legal principles and practices. Suppose, for example, that Jones buys marijuana from Smith. Jones is not, literally, a victim. He has no more grievance against Smith than if Smith were selling him newspapers or candy. Nor has Smith a complaint against Jones. In short, crimes with victims are literal crimes, whereas crimes without victims are metaphorical crimes. Of course, once people literalize their metaphors, religious, legal, or psychiatric, it becomes difficult or impossible for them to see this distinction. Yet the distinction remains and continues to bedevil those who try to treat victimless crimes like ordinary crimes. It must suffice here to indicate a few of the consequences of the literalization of this particular metaphor. Because a metaphorical crime produces no literal victim, a victim is created by legal fiat. It is said to be society. This allows agents of society to create and lodge complaints of such lawbreaking. But how do they know that a law has been broken? By themselves engaging in an unlawful act. For example, an undercover policeman impersonates a John or a drug user and entraps a prostitute or drug seller. Since there is no literally aggrieved party in such a transaction, the policeman lodges the complaint, unless he succumbs to the temptation of extorting a bribe from the prostitute or becoming a drug dealer. The rest is modern American history. Organized crime, police corruption, disrespect for law, unprotected streets and homes. The social anatomy of Surlu mental illness. As we distinguish between law-breaking and crime, so we must also distinguish between peculiar behavior and psychosis. A formal diagnosis of psychosis requires the same sort of triangular relationship as does a formal finding of crime. Here is an example. Mr. Jones persecutes his wife with complaints that she is poisoning his food and making him impotent. As long as Mrs. Jones remains silent or perhaps mentions this only to her timid elderly mother, we cannot properly speak of Mr. Jones as being psychotic. However, once Mrs. Jones goes to the local mental health center and complains about her husband's delusions, she sets in motion a social process that normally ends in Mr. Jones being formally diagnosed and perhaps committed to a mental hospital. Of course, before that happens, there is likely to be a confrontation between Mr. Jones and Mrs. Jones with certain representatives of social authority, social workers, psychiatrists, judges, entering the fray and adjudicating the conflicting claims. How do they do that? On the basis of the evidence presented to them. For example, Mrs. Jones may, in the last minute, withdraw her complaint and volunteer that she has made it up to punish Mr. Jones for his past infidelities, and Mr. Jones may behave in a socially appropriate manner in front of those formally judging his mental state, in which case he would not be committed to a mental hospital. Conversely, Mrs. Jones may stick to her accusations, called giving a history of Mr. Jones's illness, and Mr. Jones may insist that not only is his wife poisoning him, but that she is also a secret KGB agent, and that God has told him he must kill her, in which case he will surely be committed to a mental hospital. The parallels between crime and mental illness could thus hardly be more perfect. In each case, 1. Claimants advance conflicting claims concerning each other and themselves. 2. Representatives of social authority judge the validity of the conflicting claims and decide in favor of one or another party. 3. The person adjudicated as properly accused of crime or mental illness is detained for further investigation, trial, mental examination. 4. If the accused is confirmed in the suspected role, guilty, psychotic, he is incarcerated in prison or mental hospital. As a rule, the person imprisoned or hospitalized in a mental institution is the individual accused of crime or mental illness. In exceptional cases, however, the accusation can backfire and result in the accusers becoming the accused and ending up incarcerated. This is what happened to Alger Hiss, who was convicted of perjury, not of espionage. And this is what happens in James Thurber's A Unicorn in the Garden, where the nasty but normal wife who tries to commit her harmlessly eccentric husband ends up incarcerated in the booby hatch. In short, a person cannot become a criminal unless and until he is accused of a crime, nor can a person become a committed mental patient unless and until he is accused of mental illness. In both cases, the accusation may be lodged by 1. An aggrieved party, victim or relative, 2. An unaggrieved agent of the state, entrapment by policeman, recommendation by psychiatrist, or 3. The subject himself, criminal seeking conviction confesses to crimes, self-identified mental patient seeking mental hospitalization volunteers psychotic symptoms. However, the situation of the prison inmate and mental hospital inmate differ in the ways in which complaints against them are perceived and adjudicated. Briefly put, Americans see merit in the principle that a person accused of crime should be considered innocent until proven guilty, and that it is better to let 1,000 guilty persons go free than incarcerate a single innocent person. In the case of the person accused of mental illness, Americans see merit in exactly the opposite principle, namely, that such a person should be considered mentally sick until proven otherwise, and that it is better to hospitalize 1,000 persons who do not need treatment than to deprive a single person of the treatment he needs for his mental illness. This is why lawyers who help a person accused of a crime to rebut the charges against him are not considered to be the enemies of the social order, whereas psychiatrists who help a person accused of mental illness to rebut the charges against him are considered to be such enemies, as the following example illustrates. Aimlanders, a staunch advocate of mental health, systematically misidentifies treatment for mental illness as identical to treatment for medical illness. The following is her reply to a letter from a woman who complained about the difficulties facing parents trying to get their mentally sick child to accept psychiatric help. You've honed in on one of the most frustrating aspects of helping a psychotic. It is getting that person to accept treatment. Often a parent must file a complaint to enable the police to force the patient to go to a psychiatric hospital for evaluation, emphasis added. In the case of crime, Miss Landers no doubt distinguishes between a complaint filed with the police and the guilt of the accused, and supports the Anglo-American legal principle that the accused and his agents are entitled to a defense against the accusation. In the case of mental illness, however, her attitude is just the opposite. Well-meaning civil libertarians, she writes, in an effort to protect the rights of the mentally ill, have in some instances prevented such action. In short, Miss Landers views the effort to prevent a person's imprisonment in a mental hospital as unjustified. Her mindless endorsement of psychiatric deception and coercion is dramatically illustrated in the closing lines of her reply. Medication for psychotics unwilling to go to mental hospitals has been a godsend. In the old days, it was a major hassle every 4 hours to get a mental patient to take his medicine. Today, one shot of Prolixin can keep a psychotic under control for approximately 2 weeks. Enormous progress has been made, and it's the drugs that have produced miracles. Medication, miracle drugs, godsend. Clearly, there is no justification here for obstacles to the transformation of American citizens from persons into mental patients. Such is the logic of the psychiatric ideas and interventions endorsed by Miss Landers, and no doubt eagerly accepted by most of her readers. Since at this point the reader might wonder just what is wrong with Miss Landers' recommendations for therapy, her endorsement of the enormous progress that has been made in psychiatry and in general with the way so-called psychiatric problems are now managed in our society, I shall briefly restate my objections to the use of legally recognized excuses, incriminations, and incarcerations based on psychiatric criteria. Simply put, my objections rest on the classic philosophy of individual liberty, according to which it is just to punish a man for what he has done, but it is unjust to do so for what he is or thinks. This is all we mean, and can mean, high freedom under law. To punish a man, wrote Thomas Macaulay, because he has committed a crime, or because he is believed, though unjustly, to have committed a crime, is not persecution. To punish a man because we infer from the nature of some doctrine which he holds that he will commit a crime is persecution, and is, in every case, foolish and wicked. I submit that what we now call psychosis is either crime or doctrine. That is, it is either an act we should call crime and treat accordingly, or it is what Macaulay called doctrine, and we should treat it accordingly. The modern, psychiatrically enlightened intellectual believes our moral duty is to do exactly the opposite. If a dangerous psychotic commits a crime, we must not punish him, because it would be unjust to do so. Whereas if he is merely dangerous, we must restrain him, because he is ill, and it would be uncaring not to do so. This tendency of falling into therapeutic despotism and paternalism must have been apparent to classical liberals. Man, warned Macaulay, is so inconsistent a creature that it is impossible to reason from his belief to his conduct, or from one part of his belief to another. From this flows the principle that we must punish overt acts, not inward mental states. Obviously, once the incarceration of certain classes of persons is accepted as not a loss of liberty, but a gain of treatment, the whole classical liberal argument for individual liberty and responsibility becomes meaningless. But let us return, for a final observation, to our comparison of the criminal and the mental patient. The differences between crime and mental illness are actually the greatest when the subject and the object of a criminal or psychiatric complaint is the same person, the agent himself. When a person lodges a criminal complaint against himself, it is investigated the same way as if someone else had lodged it. For example, when a grisly, unsolved crime is reported by the press, and the police look for the person who did it, innocent people often come forward and confess to the crime. Such a confession is never accepted on its face value as true. On the contrary, it is treated with the utmost skepticism. On the other hand, when a person lodges a psychiatric complaint against himself, it is not investigated at all. When, for example, a man says that the FBI is sending messages to him through his gold teeth, the patient's assertion is accepted on its face value as true. Indeed, psychiatrists view it as a symptom of mental illness when, in fact, it is merely a claim. These considerations explain why pseudoscientific experiments with so-called pseudo-mental patients excite so much interest and why such experiments are worthless. See Chapter 6. Classifying the rule violator. Persons do not become patients, but may become mental patients by breaking the law, being arrested, and then being coerced into the sick role. While this is not the way people discover that they have a duodenal ulcer or leukemia, it is the way they often discover they have schizophrenia or an antisocial personality disorder. The psychiatric diagnoses then obscure why these persons are called patients and why they are confined involuntarily in buildings called hospitals. Mental patient taken to movie escapes reads a typical newspaper headline. Arrested and charged with 16 crimes, including kidnapping, threatening to murder, assault and battery with a deadly weapon, and forcible rape of a child. This offender, instead of being imprisoned to await trial, was sent to a mental hospital for psychiatric examination to determine his competence to stand trial. Automatically, such a person is called a patient. This linguistic habit, reflected in countless similar reports, makes me conclude that American doctors, lawyers, newspapermen, and the American people in general are now perfectly comfortable with the idea that a person such as this malefactor is a mental patient, and that the building in which he is forcibly, but evidently not forcibly enough, confined is a hospital. In other words, they are comfortable with the practice called diverting offenders from the criminal justice system to the mental health system. The result is that the conditions in mental hospitals and prisons, as well as the conditions of the persons incarcerated in them, tend to be similar. This is so familiar that documenting it is like beating the proverbial dead horse. But one will beat it once more, if only for a moment. In June 1985, a Senate committee headed by Senator Lowell P. Weicker, R-Con, released the results of its 6-month-long investigation of state mental hospitals. The committee, whose findings included numerous injuries among patients and staff, severe understaffing, physical abuse of patients, lack of treatment programs, came close to noting that many mental patients are in fact criminals guilty of violence against others, but stopped short of doing so. Now that dangerousness is the only criterion for involuntary hospitalization, and now that new barriers exist to treating patients, hospitals are filling up with dangerous patients who are merely being housed. One maintain, however, that the term dangerous patient is a dangerously misleading way of describing individuals who violate other people's rights to life, liberty, and property. Actually, one of the most important functions of the mental patient role and of the idea of mental illness itself is to obscure certain crimes and the psychiatric methods of dealing or failing to deal with them. The upshot is that people now repress the obvious criminality of violent mental patients in much the same way as in Victorian times they repressed the obvious sexuality of women. However, as Freud warned, the repressed inexorably returns, and when it does, hardly anyone recognizes it for what it really is. The following newspaper story is illustrative. Psychiatric centers fail to report patient crimes. State panel says, reads the headline. But what do the authorities expect? They keep telling people that mental hospital inmates are mad, not bad. How, then, can they be criminals? Easily, as the rest of the report demonstrates. Albany, December 21, 1985, AP. Directors of state psychiatric centers are breaking the law by failing to report possible crimes among patients to the police, a state commission has concluded. At 3 centers in April, there were 136 incidences of suspected assault on patients, 16 of which resulted in major injuries. In one incident withheld from the police, a patient was beaten into semi-consciousness by another patient. There is a perception among facility directors that the police do not vigorously investigate such crimes. The latter observation is a gross understatement. Psychiatrists would have to be crazy to report crimes committed by patients to the police, and they would have to be even crazier to report crimes they themselves commit. Ironically, after insisting that criminals are sick, and after forcibly evicting mental patients from mental hospitals, psychiatrists now criticize the handling of persons they call mental patients by complaining about the criminalization of mentally disordered behavior. Characteristically, psychiatrists who address this subject pretend that the clients served by the criminal and institutional psychiatric systems are the incarcerated inmates rather than those who incarcerate them. From that perspective, they see the situation this way. The finding that substance abuse and antisocial personality disorder are most often ascribed to psychiatrically ill incarcerated offenders supports the assertion that individuals are selectively unable to gain access to treatment. If the forfeited patients continue to be socially disruptive and continue to be excluded from psychiatric facilities, they will readily be accepted by the criminal justice system. The fact that the criminalization of the mentally ill is taking place can be considered a comment on the failure of psychiatry in its association with government, emphasis added. Is it true, however, that what we are witnessing is the criminalization of the mentally ill, as many psychiatrists now contend, or is it instead merely an occasional reversal in the centuries-old process of the psychiatrization of the criminal? As I have tried to show, individuals do not exist in nature labeled as criminals or mentally ill. What do exist are persons who violate social norms and who are then categorized in various ways. When masses of men, especially the pillars of society, automatically prejudge rule violators as heretics, witches, or mental patients, then we witness one of the most fundamental social mechanisms by means of which groups secure the cohesion of their members, namely scapegoating. The role of the psychiatrist. Since the roles of mental patient and psychiatrist are complementary, there remains for us to see if we can throw more light on the former by illuminating the latter. As we have had occasion to observe already, the psychiatrist's relationship with his patient is not only often paternalistic, like the physician's, but also coercive, quite unlike the physician's. Paternalism, medical and psychiatric. There is a large and largely inadequate body of literature on paternalism in medicine and psychiatry. I am critical of this literature because it is long on self-congratulatory abstractions and short on candid analyses of and clear stands on concrete medico-ethical issues. Sometimes the very definition of paternalism used by writers on medical ethics is unsatisfactory, for example, when it is defined as interfering with the decision of the patient for the sake of benefiting the patient. By omitting the adjective ostensibly before, for the sake of, these writers reveal their deep-seated bias in favor of medical paternalism, which they then proceed to defend as follows. When this medical paternalism occurs with competent patients, so-called strong paternalism occurs. Such paternalism is taken to be unjustified on most accounts in the literature. On this basis, almost all medical care turns out, we believe, to be strongly paternalistic and thus unjustified. However, if this is so, why do patients so readily accept such care? But if all of medicine is unjustifiably paternalistic, then in a strong sense none of it is. This meditation ignores the simple fact that many people, especially when they are ill, want to be treated paternalistically. The crucial question before us is not whether medical paternalism is abstractly justified or unjustified, but whether, in any particular case, it is what both doctor and patient want. If one party wants it and the other does not, there is a conflict between them that often generates another question, namely, Is either party resorting to deception or coercion to press his partner into the role performance he wants? Psychiatrists do this formally by legally committing patients and treating them against their will. Patients do it informally by producing emergencies such as suicide attempts. In my opinion, the paramount issue is whether the relationship is consensual or coercive. Whether it is paternalistic dependent or reciprocally respectful is a secondary consideration. Apparently, there is no limit to the arrogant foolishness to which doctors, especially after they take up medical ethics as a hobby, will not go. For example, Edmund Pellegrino and David Thomasma, two prominent medical ethicists, declare that the ethical aim of medicine is to assure and facilitate the patient's moral agency. Medical paternalism, especially the coercive paternalism characteristic of psychiatry, may serve many ends, but assuring and facilitating the patient's moral agency is surely not among them. Daniel X. Friedman, professor of psychiatry at the University of California in Los Angeles and a former president of the APA, goes even further. In his 1982 presidential address to the APA, he declares, "Clearly all physicians attempt to enhance the individual's wishes for optimal self-regulation of functions, both physiologic and psychologic." If that were true, physicians would be angels in a libertarian heaven. But it is not true. It is the very opposite of the truth. For example, Philip Bean, a British social scientist, offers this account of mental hospitalization in England. A GP might call, apparently routinely, but as it turned out, usually as a result of a family member making a secretive visit, and a consultant psychiatrist would subsequently visit. Sometimes the GP would say he is calling in a specialist. Rarely did he say it would be a psychiatrist. The psychiatrists occasionally colluded with this, for they seldom explained to the patient their specialism. Ironically, psychiatrists in Britain pride themselves on the fact that a much lower percentage of mental patients are hospitalized involuntarily in their country than in the United States. The difference may be due to Americans being less submissive to bureaucratic and professional authorities than Britons, or to their being more naive in believing they can effectively resist psychiatric coercion. Why do medical ethicists, psychiatrists, and other physicians distort the nature of the medical and psychiatric enterprise so outrageously? Is it possible that they do so precisely because they, too, feel disturbed by the power thrust upon physicians by the state? But the remedy for having too much power lies in renouncing and rejecting it, not in deluding oneself and others that one uses power solely to make others independent and self-reliant. When has power ever been so used by human beings? The psychiatrist's love affair with coercion. The modern physician, especially the psychiatrist, is, as I have observed earlier, in love with coercion. Illustrative is the headline in American Medical News: Team MDs call for mandatory drug tests. The coercers explain, the players' unions are making a big mistake in treating drug rehabilitation not as a treatable medical problem, but as a bargaining chip. But what business do doctors have coercing professional athletes to submit to drug testing? Why don't these malicious meddlers propose coercing their fellow physicians to submit to such testing, or their congressmen and senators? As if it wasn't bad enough to use medical rationalizations to justify depriving persons of the right to decide what substances they may ingest, such rationalizations are now also used to justify depriving persons of the right to reject ingesting substances they do not want. Moreover, as if it wasn't bad enough to subject committed mental patients to such infantilization and mistreatment, psychiatrists now also insist that psychiatric outpatients be compelled to submit to involuntary treatment. Since the 1960s, the legislatures and courts of at least 29 states have approved a policy called outpatient commitment, authorizing psychiatrists to exercise the powers of quasi-therapeutic parole officers, compelling legally competent, unincarcerated persons to submit to psychiatric drugging. Outpatient commitment, explains a report in Psychiatric News, is aimed at chronic mentally ill patients who respond well to medication while in the hospital but stop taking it once they leave. However, I view this phenomenon as evidence that psychiatrists and patients have different criteria for what constitutes responding well to antipsychotic drugs, a heretical interpretation in the eyes of psychiatrists. Moreover, the outpatient commitment process itself is described as being less formal than that for inpatient commitment, patients being ordered to outpatient treatment, emphasis added. I emphasize the word treatment because later in the report, we learn that judges are committing patients to outpatient treatment without clinical advice or even against the judgment of the hospital or CMHC, Community Mental Health Center staff. Are psychiatrists who refuse to treat such patients in contempt of court? Need more be said? Perhaps nothing demonstrates the depth of the disjunction between rhetoric and reality in psychiatry as clearly as the fact that while no group of professionals in the United States today protests its paternalistic commitment to being compassionate and wanting to help more loudly than psychiatrists, no group is more reviled by the ostensible beneficiaries of its ministrations. Of course, involuntarily confined mental patients have always complained about the loss of liberty inflicted on them by psychiatrists. However, their traditional protest that they had been falsely committed only served to reinforce the legitimacy of psychiatric incarceration. Their complaint implied that they accepted the standard psychiatric justification for coercion. In other words, as everyone agreed that persons guilty of murder were rightly imprisoned, so everyone, including former mental patients, agreed that persons correctly diagnosed as insane were rightly committed. The fact that former mental patients insisted that they had been incorrectly diagnosed as insane only proved the accuracy of the diagnosis. In the early 1970s, after the publication of The Myth of Mental Illness and the Manufacture of Madness, in which, on epistemological, moral, and political grounds, I rejected the legitimacy of civil commitment and the insanity defense, the protest tactics of former mental hospital patients changed radically. Having overcome their belief in the mythology of mental illness, they began, first of all, to call themselves psychiatric inmates or victims, instead of patients. Moreover, freed of the invalidating identity imposed on them by their adversaries, relatives as well as psychiatrists, they were able to relinquish their defensive identification with their oppressors, and with it the counterproductive claim of "I have been railroaded." Instead, by assuming their rightful identities as responsible moral agents, former mental hospital patients were able to respect themselves and their fellow victims, combine forces with one another, and, like the members of any other special interest group in a free society, assert their right to speak for themselves. The result was that they began to demonstrate regularly against psychiatrists at their professional meetings. A mimeographed leaflet distributed at the 1983 convention of the APA in New York City included this invitation: "Come and join us in a day of peaceful protest against the American Psychiatric Association. Each year, hundreds of thousands of Americans are deprived of their human rights by psychiatry. Stop psychiatry before it stops you." I consider this to be a momentous advance in the struggle to return the so-called mental patient to his full stature as a human being, restored to liberty by being protected from psychiatric imprisonment and torture, and hopefully restored to responsibility by being deprived of the excuse of the insanity defense. Nothing like the demonstration of former psychiatric inmates against psychiatrists happens to other medical specialists. The only similar situations that come to mind are the demonstrations against abortion clinics. However, the anti-abortion demonstrators claim to represent the fetus whose interest in living undeniably conflicts with the pregnant woman's interest in not wanting to give it birth. Most people, regardless of where they stand on this issue, are able to see merit in the claims of both parties. However, when former mental patients demonstrate against involuntary mental hospitalization and treatment, most people are unable or unwilling to see merit in the contentions of those opposed to psychiatric coercions. What psychiatrists do, bridging the gap between rhetoric and reality in psychiatry, would require greater self-disclosure by psychiatrists concerning what they believe and do, and greater candor by non-psychiatrists, especially by members of the media, concerning the performance of all the actors who play a role in the human tragedies we now call mental diseases and psychiatric treatment. For starters, I offer the following classification. not of mental patients, but of psychiatrists. My criterion for classifying them, I might add, is based not on what they may say, but on what they do. A. Psychiatrists in the housing and prison business. 1. Psychiatrists in public mental hospitals, operators of cheap hotels and wardens to the poor and unimportant and their unwanted relatives. 2. Psychiatrists in private mental hospitals, operators of better hotels and wardens to the rich and important and their unwanted relatives. 3. Anti-psychiatrists in counter institutions, operators of flop-houses for the poor and unimportant. B. Psychiatrists in the business of drugging. 1. Neuropharmacological psychiatrists, dealers in psychopharmacological. 2. General psychiatrists, dealers in a combination of psychopharmacological and advice regarding life management. C. Psychiatrists in the business of producing brain damage. 1. The lobotomists, dealers in amputating the frontal lobes. 2. The electroshockers, dealers in delivering artificial epilepsy. 3. The insulin coma producers, dealers in insulin overdosage. D. Psychiatrists in the business of conversation and moral guidance. 1. Psychoanalysts, dealers in the cult of Freudianism. 2. Dynamic psychotherapists, dealers in adjustment to the dominant ethic. 3. Psychotherapists of other persuasions, dealers in the principles and practices of various ethical systems. The fallacy of criticizing the harmfulness of certain psychiatric treatment. Psychiatrists have always imposed their currently fashionable interventions on their patients without the patient's consent or against his will, and mental patients, not all of them, but many, have always maintained that what the psychiatrist did was not treatment, but torture. In view of this history, it is hardly surprising that some former mental patients and some psychiatrists who feel guilty about having participated in the somatic treatment of involuntary patients now wage campaigns against certain specific modern psychiatric interventions, especially ECT. Although, in my opinion, the contention that lobotomy, ECT, and the major antipsychotic drugs cause brain damage is valid indeed, it seems to me self-evident pushing this opinion on the public is dangerously misleading and clearly counterproductive. The reason for this is that the claim that a particular psychiatric treatment, say ECT, is bad implies first that it is a bona fide treatment, and hence that there is a condition justifiably regarded as mental illness, which it is intended to ameliorate or cure. Second, that although this particular treatment may be bad, some other treatment might not be. All this is grist for the mill of conventional psychiatry. Obviously, psychiatrists can generate evidence for the beneficial effects of, say, ECT much faster than the ostensible critics of psychiatry can generate evidence for its detrimental effects. Moreover, this line of argument makes it easy for psychiatrists to abandon the criticized intervention in favor of a newer method and then claim further advances in their therapeutic powers, as they have done, for example, by substituting antidepressant drugs for ECT. Worst of all, the argument about the ineffectiveness or dangerousness of one or another psychiatric treatment distracts attention from, and indeed undermines, what I consider to be the two most valid objections against contemporary psychiatric interventions. First, that in the absence of literal illness, there can be no literal treatment. In other words, there is, and can be, no such thing as a mental or psychiatric treatment. And second, that without informed and uncoerced consent by the patient, no medical or psychiatric intervention is justified, while with consent every such intervention is justified, even if there is no illness and even if the intervention is considered to be harmful by its critics, provided that the procedure does not injure innocent third parties. In short, by dwelling on the deleteriousness of ECT or neuroleptic drugs, the ostensible critics of psychiatry try to beat psychiatrists at their own game and on their own grounds. In the process, the critics neglect to use their strongest weapon, namely, insisting that the controversy is not about the effectiveness or ineffectiveness of any particular psychiatric intervention, but about consent versus coercion. In other words, that as I have indicated, with consent, even ineffective or worthless treatments ought to be permitted, whereas without it, even treatments officially deemed effective ought not to be. Unfortunately, In their zeal to combat psychiatry, and especially certain brutal interventions, many would-be critics of psychiatry espouse the same intolerance and coerciveness toward those who disagree with them as do their psychiatric adversaries. Finally, I want to re-emphasize the obvious, namely that people are both similar to and different from one another. It is human diversity, or perversity, that accounts for two stubborn facts, one upsetting to psychiatrists, the other to the critics of somatic treatments. The first is that, regardless of how beneficial certain interventions might be according to psychiatrists, some mental patients will consider them to be harmful and reject them. This upsets the psychiatrists who want to force the patients to submit to their care and cure. The other is that, regardless of how harmful and brain-damaging certain somatic treatments might be according to their critics, some persons will eagerly seek out such treatments and will willingly submit to them. This upsets the critics who want to coerce both psychiatrists and patients to refrain from engaging in certain consensual treatment relationships. Respect for the liberty and responsibility of mental patients and psychiatrists requires that we eschew both of these postures and look to a mechanism such as the psychiatric will to enhance the autonomy of all the agents participating in TIDS drama. However, so long as most people, including psychiatrists, anti-psychiatrists, and psychiatric patients, prefer coercive to contractual relations, there is no reason to expect such a peaceful resolution of the problem. Paternism and coercion reconsidered. The relationship between patient and physician is typically cooperative. The patient wants to get treatment, and the physician wants to give it. By contrast, the relationship between the mental patient and the psychiatrist is typically antagonistic. The patient wants to engage in certain kinds of behavior, and the psychiatrist wants to prevent him from doing so. Lest this seem an exaggeration, let me say only that my construction follows inexorably from taking commitment statutes seriously. With monotonous regularity, such statutes focus and have always focused on the patient's alleged dangerousness to himself and/or others. Clearly, then, the seriously ill mental patient is a person who is, or is considered to be, dangerous, and the institutional psychiatrist is a person who tries to cure or control the patient's dangerousness. Thus, one of the most obvious differences between the medical and psychiatric situations is that the physician controls diseases, not persons, whereas the psychiatrist controls persons, not diseases. This, of course, is an aphorism, not an assertion. And an aphorism, as the Austrian aphorist Karl Kraus noted, is either a half-truth or a truth and a half, which one the reader must decide. Let me add only that so far as the physician's role is concerned, he cannot, strictly speaking, ever treat a disease without taking cognizance of the person who has it. However, in a medical situation that is at once ideally cooperative and technicalized, by treating the patient's disease, the physician also treats the patient. In contrast, since there is no mental disease, the psychiatrist can never treat the patient's disease. However, in a psychiatrist mental patient situation that is at once ideally coercive and technicalized, by pretending to treat the patient's fictitious disease, the psychiatrist also controls the patient. But let us return to the medical situation. As everyone knows, until the post-World War I years, the typical American physician was a privately practicing professional, whereas the typical American psychiatrist was a state-employed bureaucrat. After the Second World War, physicians began to enter into a progressively more intimate alliance with the state, gradually exchanging their roles as healers for those of employees of medical bureaucracies or agencies of the state. As a result, doctors now seem completely blind to the fundamental distinction between constructing a scientifically defined and justified criterion of health and coercing a person to adopt a lifestyle that promotes his health. The analogy between health and gold may again help to make this point clear. Let us assume, as scientifically proven, that smoking cigarettes and a diet high in cholesterol are conducive to atherosclerosis. Those are then facts, just as the atomic weight or chemical properties of gold are facts. Whether a person in possession of such information accepts or rejects a medically healthy lifestyle, and whether physicians and the state play a role in directly or indirectly forcing a person to adhere to such a lifestyle are, however, matters not of science, but of ethics or politics. Obviously, the state could employ and empower chemists to force people to adopt one or another kind of economic attitude toward gold, and, given sufficient monetary of political rewards, there would be no shortage of chemists willing and eager to play such a role. But no chemist today would think that such a hypothetical chemist coercing his fellow citizens would be anything other than an agent of the state. Nevertheless, physicians think of themselves as scientists and want to be so regarded by the public. Actually, aided and abetted by a health-obsessed society, physicians now act as if knowing what health is and what impairs it would give them a special right to interfere with people's right or free will to choose to be unhealthy. A situation illustrating that, regardless of how scientific his medical methods may be, the modern physician has virtually no sense of, and does not value, the ethics of science as truth-finding and truth-telling. I am not saying here that science is better or worse than religion or politics. That is not the point. The point is that they are different, and that insofar as the scientist uses his knowledge to justify, and indeed to engage in, coercion, he becomes, conceptually and morally, indistinguishable from the inquisitor or dictator. After all, not so long ago, the priest, having defined heaven and hell, knew all about them. Accordingly, the priest believed, and people agreed, that he was entitled to coerce individuals to live so that they maximize their chances of going to heaven and minimize their chances of going to hell. Regrettably, the lofty goal called heaven sometimes required killing people, a clerical measure warmly endorsed by the theologians. Today, doctors threaten and coerce people so as to make them healthy and live as long as possible. Since many people refuse to cooperate with the doctor's health rules, the physician feels justified, and the people agree that he is entitled to spoil their pleasures by intimidating and torturing them. Regrettably, the lofty goal called health often requires making people mentally sick, a clinical measure warmly endorsed by physicians. By this I mean inventing mental illness terms and attaching them to certain patterns of unwanted behaviors. See Chapter 3. Doctors and patients have come a long way since the 19th century, but we had better think twice before we conclude it has all been progress. It is of more than passing interest to note, in this connection, one of the definitions of the word profession in the Oxford English Dictionary. A profession in our country, wrote a British gentleman named Maurice in 1829, is expressly that kind of business which deals primarily with men as men, and is thus distinguished from a trade which provides for the external wants or occasions of men. Until recently, this criterion applied particularly to the practice of medicine and law, the relations between practitioners and their clients being based on mutual respect and trust, and of course, the studied avoidance of coercion. Since psychiatrists do not deal with men as men, but on the contrary, deal with men as madmen, psychiatry fails, by this criterion, to qualify as a profession. Although Maurice's definition of a profession may now strike us as quaint and old-fashioned, it should serve as a reminder of how radically the meaning of the word profession has changed since the 19th century. Formerly, the professional was a person who had a personal relationship with his clients based on mutual respect and reciprocity. Today, the professional is a person who has an impersonal relationship with his clients based on his superior and their inferior competence in a specialized area of knowledge or skill. The psychiatrist and the mental patient as adversaries. An important feature of legitimate power is that its very existence induces people to submit to it voluntarily, that is, because they believe that the behavior prescribed is right, or because they fear punishment for deviating from it. Thus, most people subject to taxation or traffic laws willingly pay their taxes and obey the rules of the road. Similarly, most people subject to mental health laws voluntarily consent to mental hospitalization. This is why the standard psychiatric argument that since only a minority of the persons in mental hospitals is detained involuntarily, involuntary mental hospitalization is not an important issue, is specious and unpersuasive. Actually, so long as incarceration in a mental hospital is a legally legitimate and socially approved procedure, we cannot meaningfully speak of anyone entering or remaining in a mental hospital voluntarily. We must keep this always in mind when we consider the controversy concerning commitment and other coerced psychiatric interventions. Although official psychiatric rhetoric conceals the frequently antagonistic relationship between psychiatrist and mental patient, informal psychiatric publications, the so-called throwaway journals, allow us to see things as they are. The following excerpt, entitled Types of Problem Patients on a Locked Unit, comes from such a source. Presumably, if the patient were cooperative, he would not have been admitted or transferred to the locked units to begin with. The most frequent problem encountered is the patient who refuses to do whatever it is we think he should do. Some patients start right out refusing to talk, a rather perplexing problem for a new intern who just finished a course in history taking and sits expectantly, pen in hand, only to be greeted by a stony silence. Other refusals, not necessarily in order of either importance or frequency, include refusal of medication, refusal to sign consent for electroconvulsive therapy, refusal to go for electroconvulsive therapy after signing the consent, refusal to attend activities, and ultimately refusal to accept discharge plans. Why do psychiatrists systematically impose themselves on persons who want to have nothing to do with them? I believe they do so because, like most people, psychiatrists love power and exult in pushing others around. We must take a stand, declares H. Richard Lamb, a professor of psychiatry at the University of Southern California, for involuntary treatment, both acute and ongoing. Such interventions should not be limited to those who can be proven to be dangerous. Similar statements abound in the psychiatric literature. Yet, when they are criticized for using coercive methods, psychiatrists often defend themselves by claiming that they dislike treating patients against their will and do it only out of a deep sense of civic and moral duty. However, that is patently untrue, as the whole history of psychiatry proves. Nor, in this connection, must we overlook the fact that the role of psychiatrist, like that of mental patient, is entirely voluntary. No one in the United States is forced to become a physician. No physician is forced to become trained as a psychiatrist. No one so trained is forced to practice conventional psychiatry. Accordingly, if a psychiatrist engages in the manufacture of involuntary mental patients either through the mechanism of civil commitment or through the mechanism of the insanity defense, then he proves by his actions that he enjoys being a coercive paternalist. Indeed, so passionately convinced are psychiatrists about the rightfulness of treating patients against their will that they contemptuously denounce those remaining few who refuse to treat involuntary patients. Such psychiatrists, say the coercers, reject treating the sick, avoid the most difficult cases, and are unworthy of being psychiatrists. Be that as it may, distinguishing between paternalism and coercion allows us to lay to rest, once and for all, the claim that, because both medical and psychiatric practices tend to be paternalistic, the differences between them are negligible. In addition, it allows us to identify the various combinations of these two elements and thus reaffirm the crucial differences between caring for patients, coercing mental patients, and confining prisoners. The medical situation may be paternalistic or non-paternalistic, but cannot be coercive. The psychiatric situation may be paternalistic or non-paternalistic, and in addition may be coercive as well. Coercion without paternalism characterizes the relationship between a decent jailer and his civilized prisoner. See Table 4.2. Table 4.2. Paternalism and coercion. Treatment, coercion, contract. Nature and name of medical relationship. Paternalism with coercion. Most medical interventions vis-a-vis children. All involuntary psychiatric interventions, called involuntary treatment. Paternalism without coercion, medical and voluntary psychiatric interventions vis-a-vis consenting clients, treated as if they were dependents rather than partners, called voluntary treatment. Coercion without paternalism, civilized penal sanctions, the lawful punishing of lawbreakers without condescension, called punishment, fine, probation, prison sentence. Neither paternalism nor coercion, giving and receiving help based on mutual respect between responsible adults, called contract, help, therapy, treatment. Sadly, however, a persistent professional and popular unwillingness to recognize that mental patients are persons first and patients second, coupled with a stubborn refusal to treat them as persons rather than as mental patients, vitiates all current efforts, sincere or otherwise, to help them. We recognize that a person considered to be sick is a person first and a patient second. If such a person chooses not to be a patient, no one says that he rejects treatment precisely because of his illness. However, if a person considered to be mentally sick wants to reject treatment, that is exactly what most people say. Politicians are no exception. Witness New York City Mayor Ed Koch's comment that a person who is mentally ill often resists treatment precisely because of his illness. This image is completely out of focus. Mayor Koch's remark reflects the distortion built into our picture of psychiatry. Like his constituency, the mayor views treatment accorded the involuntary mental patient as a psychiatric or mental health service. But the term service implies not only that it is something provided for the recipient, but also that the recipient has the option to reject it. Normally, saying that a person is receiving services involuntarily, for example, from an electric utility company, would be a clear case of talking nonsense. In such a context, the term involuntary service is an oxymoron. Only in relation to the involuntary mental patient do we speak of his receiving services and accept the locution as legitimate. This, perhaps, is the most important evidence of how mercilessly we infantilize him.